Hi, everyone. John Hammontree here, and welcome to another episode of the Reckon Interview Live. This week, we are talking with Camille Bennett, the founder and executive director of Project Say Something. Camille, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Project Say Something is? I know you've been doing this work since 2014, at least. So what is your organization and what's the mission?
We're a nonprofit, a 501c3. Our mission is to confront racial injustice through Black history by using communication, education, and community empowerment to reconcile the past with the present. So we're, for all intents and purposes, a nonprofit that confronts racial injustice in Alabama.
So when you started in 2014, was there a particular event that was on your mind as you were putting this organization together, or was it something specific to Florence, something nationwide?
You know, John, I didn't even know I was putting an organization together.
Okay.
It was as simple as the Ferguson riots were happening. I also have a spiritual center, and folks said, hey, can we open up the doors and have a conversation about race? I literally had no idea of what I was walking into. I opened the doors and it was a packed house and we just talked, and it grew from there.
That's great. One of the, I guess, signature conversations that y'all have started up there in Florence is a conversation around a Confederate monument that is downtown. What is the effort to remove that monument been like? How long has it been going on? And where does it stand now?
Okay. Well, I want to say that the effort started 3 years ago. We came up with a proposal. This was soon after the Memorial Preservation Act in 2017. The question became, okay, obviously Confederate monuments are problematic, especially in front of spaces that represent justice, right? And the question became, so what can we do, right? Obviously, this law has been put in place to protect these monuments. You saw Birmingham put up, like, I think it was plank or plasters up in front of them. And it was like, okay, how can we be creative and really push this narrative out that these monuments are overtly racist and problematic? And so we created a proposal around Dred and Harriet Scott to erect a monument that counterbalances what's currently being said. And Dred Scott actually lived here in Florence for 10 years. Many historians say that his case sparked the Civil War. It was one of the worst decisions given by the Supreme Court. So he really had a profound case against why slavery should be abolished. And he was just a perfect fit to counterbalance what was currently standing. We went through that process for years, and ultimately our county commissioners lied, said that there was a policy that says that they couldn't erect new monuments. When we asked them for that policy, they said it was a verbal policy. So that tells us it wasn't a policy at all. It was dead in the water, but we kept talking about it. And then fast forward to today, Birmingham's Confederate monument came down. And as soon as that happened, we were like, okay, ready, set, go.
And we're seeing monuments come down all around
Absolutely.
the state, all around the South. And yet Florence's city council is not budging so far. Is that fair to say?
So the city council is in favor of relocating the monument to the Soldiers' Rest Cemetery. What's happening right now is they need a resolution from our county commissioners saying that because the county commissioners are saying the statue belongs to the city, but our city needs a resolution from the county saying you have permission to come onto this property and relocate this monument. So it's really a legal issue, and right now the county commissioners are not giving that up yet.
Well, and it seems like from the beginning you've gotten a lot of support from the community. I know Single Lock Records, John Paul White, people like that have been doing fundraisers to support the monument removal. From what we've seen in Birmingham and elsewhere, you know, most communities are having to pay a $25,000 fine for that removal, a one-time fine. It sounds like a lot of that money has probably already been raised. Is that?
So an anonymous family in Florence actually pledged the money for not only the removal, but for any subsequent damages to property. Wow. So that money's been pledged. However, Project Say Something doesn't have that check, right? So it's we also had to simultaneously fundraise on our own. So
it seems like the only thing kind of standing in the way is this resolution, I guess.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about that is the county commissioners drafted the president, or the chair of the county commissioners. He drafted a letter that said, but it was just him, that said, hey, you know, it's not our statue. Didn't necessarily say come and get the statue, but had language that kind of insinuated that. And that was what they needed. However, that letter is not a legal document. The county commissioners are a body. So they have to vote on a resolution and draft a resolution. And we're literally asking them to just cut and paste what they put in the letter into the resolution. And we don't understand why that's taking so long.
Is there any sense of when they would be meeting again to vote on something like this?
Yes. On Monday, this coming Monday, which would be, I don't have a calendar in front of me, the 6th.
July 6th, I think that's right.
Discussing whether or not the resolution goes on the agenda. And then that following Monday, which I think is the 12th, they would have their actual official meeting. Now, in those meetings, you know, you can't talk directly to the county commissioners. You can only speak out during the public comment section.
Now, I want to remind everybody who's watching, this is open to live Q&A. So if you have questions for Camille, please leave them in the comments and we'll try to answer them as best we can. This monument, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as old as some of the monuments in the state. It wasn't built in the early 1900s. This one was built in the 60s. Is that right?
No, it was erected. It was erected in 1903.
1903. Okay.
You're onto something. You're onto something about it being erected in the 60s, and I'll get to that. So in 1903, it was erected. There was a speech given by Moody, very racist speech, which we've actually created a video about, and that was like 3 years ago. That was our first narrative push about how racist that speech is, right? But in 1903, it was erected. That was at the old courthouse. That's like a door down.
Got it.
The new courthouse was built in around the 60s, and I think in 1965, they moved the monument from the old courthouse to the new courthouse. Now, this is what's really important to know. This happened March 30th of 1965. Guess what happened March 7th of 1965 in Alabama?
I'm gonna guess.
Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday, yeah.
Bloody Sunday. So it was quite deliberate, right? That statue did not need to come with our community, but it's still in the height of such civil unrest and racial terror. It was still relocated with the new courthouse,
which feels very deliberate to everything that was happening.
It really does. And there's a timeline that shows that there were a lot of Confederate monuments erected around that time. 1903, Reconstruction. 1965, Civil Rights Movement.
And the story that's commonly told, I guess, about Florence and the Muscle Shoals area is that at that time, compared to the rest of the state, you know, black and white musicians in particular were getting along fairly well. But is that kind of a sugar-coated story, do you think? Is that accurate?
I would say so. And it depends on like how you define racism, right? So we can't say that musicians didn't come here and make beautiful music together, because they did. But we also need to look at what was happening structurally. Did systemic racism exist during that time? Was there segregation? Was there wealth inequity? Were we fighting the same fights that Alabama as a whole was fighting? And we absolutely were. So that emotional story, which really I call out the area and saying you're really capitalizing on a false narrative. Is it true that white and black people came together and made beautiful music? Yes. But that doesn't need to translate into there was no structural racism in our community, because obviously there was.
And I guess that leads me into my next question. You know, obviously there's a lot of pushback on the right from removing these monuments, you know, because they say heritage, not history, and heritage and all of that stuff. You know, I've also seen some criticism from the left, I guess, that say, you know, is removing flags, is removing monuments, is it just cosmetic and kind of gives people a pass in terms of getting to some of the more structural issues? So, I mean, I know Project Say Something has been dedicated to trying to tackle racism on all fronts, but, you know, what else does Florence, what else does Alabama, what else does the South and the country need to do beyond just a conversation about monuments?
I think I'm going to go back to what this process looks like for us as
Sure.
we advocate and do sustained protests, which means we're protesting 5 days a week on for the relocation of the monuments. So this process, if you choose to look at it in a short-sighted way and say the only goal is to relocate this monument, you miss a ton of structural issues. So through this process, we've uncovered nurses, business owners, community members, a city employee that work and serve in our community, in the public, that are making overtly racist statements and really digging in and saying, this is my heritage, and more hateful comments that come along the way. And what I think that process does is it really exposes how systemic and how embedded racism is in our everyday lives. So that's one way you can look at it. And I think it's really important also for this community, because I mentioned in the 60s, and I mean, during slavery, we have the same history of racism that Alabama has, but because of the demographics of our community, I mean, we make up maybe 11% of both counties, between 11 and 15%, there was no active resistance. There were no protests here. That's never happened before. Not outwardly so. Now, that's not to say there weren't politicians and civil rights leaders, right? But from my elders say that they traveled south to Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma. So this resistance is much bigger than the relocation of a Confederate monument, right? What it is this: we can actively resist anti-Black racism here, and we're going to do it for the first time in a sustained way.
And we have seen excuse me, larger protests in the area in the wake of the George Floyd murder up in Florence. You've been having some of these protests and public conversations and things like that. Is that right?
Yes, I mean there have been several events around the George Floyd murder, and I will also, or lynching. What I will also add to is, you know, a lot of people after that happened, after that lynching happened, it was an immediate intolerance of structural racism. People became, so that's why you're seeing people like, you know what, I don't think I can live with this anymore. I think it's you know, what can you see? What can you touch that's right in your community that's screaming at you, you know, Black lives really don't matter, right? And so I think that's why you're seeing this trend. So it's much bigger than meets the eye.
We do have a question in from Banjo McCrawdad, and I know this is obviously outside of your immediate backyard, but how do you see Stone Mountain being renovated, and what would you like to see on its face instead? Is that something that you've thought about?
It is not, and I hate to have like tunnel vision, and I care about our entire nation, obviously, as it relates to racial justice. But my eye's been on the prize of what we have to do here in Alabama.
Well, and for those of you who are watching who aren't familiar with Stone Mountain, it is a monument in just outside of Atlanta, Stone Mountain, Georgia, that I guess would be comparative to Mount Rushmore, to the Crazy Horse Monument, but it is 4 Confederate generals that have been blasted into a mountain there in Atlanta, and it's a question of whether or not that one is even removable, I guess.
I mean, they should all be removable, right? I'll speak to that. I mean, if you travel to Birmingham, to Germany, and you see shrines to the Holocaust,
right?
You see swastikas everywhere, right? Or even if you flew a swastika here, what does that look like, and what does that mean? And it's actually illegal. So that same sentiment needs to be here in the United States. I mean, it's if you unpack the history, it makes no sense. It is overtly racist to celebrate the Confederacy in any way.
Right. And in addition to this work, you have also been tracking COVID impact on the Black community. I don't know if that's statewide or if that's just in North Alabama. Is that right?
It's been in a very detailed way and an intricate way. So we formed the Alabama Child Care Coalition, and we provide support for child care centers across the state that serve predominantly marginalized and low income children. And what we're finding is child care centers are disproportionately owned by African American women, that the state itself, child care subsidy, 80% of the children that receive it are Black. And so the question is, how can we protect these very vulnerable communities through policy reform and making sure that, because the issue that we see in Alabama is there aren't a lot of provider-led movements. So there are certainly agencies that advocate for child care and child care owners and providers, but they're not led by the child care owners and providers. And so it's been really just connecting with owners and finding out what we need and advocating.
What is it that you're advocating for?
Well, I'll tell you what we had to advocate for.
Okay.
Right now, things have stabilized, thankfully. But what we had to advocate for was sustained subsidy support, right? So if we can't take in as many children due to COVID, and Alabama changed the law and said, well, now you can just pack in your center.
Everybody can come in, yeah.
But that's still not realistic, because you have parents that are terrified right now. Not only that, a lot of centers are saying, if I choose, many are not, but if I choose to open, I'd like to only serve essential workers, right? Because I need my numbers to be lower. I need our centers to be, the less numbers you have, the safer you are. Now, I will say, you cannot socially distance at child care centers. That's not a realistic expectation at all. You can try, but it's not realistic. So making sure that there are policies in place that say, we're gonna do everything we can to support these centers, because if that support is taken away, our industry is really gonna suffer. And I will also say, Alabama, prior to COVID, had a access to care issue, meaning that there were more children receiving the subsidy than there were licensed daycares. Does that make sense? Or child care centers?
Yes. So that means that there were I don't want to say too many kids, but there were more kids than there were spots. Is that right? Okay.
Exactly. So you pile COVID on top of that, then you have even more of a crisis. So just making sure that we stayed in front of legislators. Like, there was a small business task force appointed by Will Ainsworth, and we wrote an open letter to them and just said, hey, we see your recommendations, but we need to have a voice within your recommendations, because we're living out this crisis, and we need to talk about what we need.
And people can find out more about that at projectsaysomething.org and other documentation of how the COVID crisis is affecting Black people in Alabama?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about you and what kind of motivates you to do this work, to speak out, to say something. When did you kind of get active in the community there in Florence? Did you grow up in Florence?
I did. I moved here at 13 from the Caribbean, actually, and I've lived other places as well. But I say I'm from here because I'm 42 now, and if I'm not,
it counts.
I'm from here. I gotta be. And my father is from here, and my grandparents and great grandparents, and so on. So I do have a strong history, ancestral history here. In terms of racial justice work, a lot of my high school friends say you were always kind of, because our high school was really, really, we had major issues with race. We were very small part of the population, and a lot happened to us at that school. It was Muscle Shoals High School. And I remember trying to create movements then, or really trying to speak out. But at the same time, I'm a kid, so I'm not really as focused. I'm like, I still want to go to this party, or still want to talk to my boyfriend too. So that kind of thing. And then you hear the saying woke, I would say a couple of years before I founded Project Say Something, I started to have an awakening and really studying Black history and systemic racism and how it affects us right here where we are. And then just kind of organically grew from there. And what makes me be this way, I don't know, it's a passion. And the main thing is that it's a commitment.
Yeah.
More than anything.
Well, thank you for doing it. We have another question from Banjo. How can those outside of Alabama help garner support for Project Say Something and your work? What's the best way for people to support?
There are a couple of ways. We are a Black-led racial justice org in Alabama, which means we are underfunded. So donations are always going to be a huge way to help support what we're doing. Another way you can support us is get our information out on a national level. Dr. Martin Luther King our civil rights leaders were onto something as they were doing the protests in Alabama. They understood that they needed that national media attention to shine a spotlight on the injustices that happen in Alabama. Alabama has a hard time with dealing with them internally. So we always need that external support to really shine a light on what it's like here. And
they can make those donations at projectsaysomething.org.
Yes, there is a donate button at the top. And then also you should be able to find a email link as well, so that if you have any contacts or any people that you think you can connect us with, that will be very helpful. You can just email.
People can find you on Facebook if they just search Project Say Something.
Yes.
And on Twitter, you are Stay Woke South, at Stay Woke South. So anybody who's watching it on Twitter, you can go follow her right now. Looks like Banjo says thank you so much.
You're welcome.
What else is on your mind these days? You know, kind of to wrap up, what else? I mean, you're focused on getting the monument changed. Do you think that there will be a chance that the Scott Monument will go up in its place, or is that kind of?
We're not interested in that. Once we relocate, they can put a little flower garden or something. Let's just move on.
Sure.
You know, I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, let's move on and let's get into the systemic issues, which we already are. Like I said, as we're working through this process, we're also dismantling the white supremacy that we see that's accompanied with it. I just like to add again, I'm always going to try and share what it's like to be an activist here in North Alabama. I get a lot of questions about, like, do you have like a huge Black following? What are the demographics? Why does it seem like it's so much harder? And I always want to highlight that, number one, Black people make up between 10 and 15% of the population. Number two, the League of the South is in Killen, Alabama, which is very close by. The League of the South was at Charlottesville. So we do have white nationalist presence. And I also want to highlight what we've experienced as we navigate this process. There have been threats, death threats, daily death threats, threats of violence, and counter protesters that are on the rise. So that's a part of it here. Allyship is definitely a part of it here. Because of the demographics, and I just always want to highlight what our process looks like and why.
Those threats, have they deterred you in any way? I mean, have you had to hire any sort of protection? Have you security? Are you worried about those threats?
No.
Okay.
I'm not afraid.
Well, Camille, thank you so much. Again, you can find her at Stay Woke South. You can find more about the organization at projectsaysomething.org. You can find them on Facebook just by searching Project Say Something. If you enjoyed this conversation, I do want to remind everybody who's watching that this week on the podcast, The Reckon Interview, I spoke with Dr. Hillary Green. You can download that wherever you get your podcasts. We also spoke about some of the efforts around the country to remove monuments, the history of these monuments. So give it a listen, and it may help supplement some of what we talked about today. And Camille, thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This is great.